Good morning. It's not morning. Sorry. Good afternoon. Before you do, you have to dream a little bit. And this is especially true in science. Since Mary Shelley first posited the idea of creating life in a laboratory, science fiction's dreamers have inspired so many of us to move towards advances that have really changed the world. But now we're in a time when we are checking off list items like it's a shopping list. And it's a really amazing time to be alive. People are living in space, like right now. And at this summit where so many people have the opportunity to actually make things happen, we thought it'd be important to talk about the role in looking back at some of the fiction and some of the dreamers who have actually inspired us to create so many wonderful things and really examine what we should be focusing on. In the world they've built in their blockbuster science fiction series, The Expanse, James S.A. Corey, who's actually two people, Franck and Daniel Abraham, over the course, yeah, we can clap for that. Over the course of 8 books, 6 novels, 36 television episodes, Ty and Daniel display a deepness of thought that may someday provide as important to our off-world explorers as the technology that drives the ships they're in. And we're here to talk about not just their own work, but the work of their contemporaries that have inspired them and in turn inspiring us. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, please welcome Ty Franck and Daniel Abraham and James S.A. Corey. I'm Joe Brown. I'm the editor-in-chief of Popular Science, and we are partnering with the World Government Summit on some really exciting conversations. I think this is the last one, unfortunately, but I'm sure all of you saw the others, and I thank you for that. I want to start talking about your world, The Expanse, and the sort of key theme that you are exploring in it. Social pressures, tribalism, and inequality of multiple sorts. It's pretty clear that no matter how much we push towards solving that, we're going to take that with us wherever we go. Would you agree with that, or?
You see, you ask questions like that, and we say, yes, and then we're quiet again, and it's going to be very frustrating for you. No, absolutely.
You can try it.
One of the things that we tried to do when we built the world that we're writing in was take the kinds of issues that we've seen in our present and in history and find a way to recast them so that you can look at them without the context of history and without the burden of history or the burden of taking someone else's experience and appropriating it as your own. So we posited a group of kind of blue-collar miners out in the asteroid belt who became our stand-in for disenfranchised people throughout history.
And so when you were talking about that, in I guess you guys, for those who don't know, they co-write these books together, so it brings a really interesting bit of interplay between the two of you, that you're actually working out these issues and talking about them and how you're going to address them in the book. What was the sort of starting point for figuring out where the conflict was going to be?
Yeah, well, the conflict arises naturally from the setting. One of the things that I've been hearing people talk about here in the space track is the resources that exist in space, and especially the question of who owns those resources. When people go out and start mining asteroids or things like that, who gets to decide what the ownership laws are for those things? And so just taking that as a starting place, that there's this enormous wealth that's available, and people go to start to try to collect this wealth, who gets to decide who keeps it? Is it the people who actually dig it out of the rocks? Is it the people back on Earth who sign the contracts? And so the conflict sort of naturally arises from that question.
So in our world, we do have agreements about who gets to keep what in space, and actually there was a panel on this yesterday. But there is that central question of, like, why should people on this planet decide what we're going to be doing outside of this planet when even the positions relative to one another are changing so frequently? Like, how have you really teased that out in the book, and what have you sort of come across?
Yeah, it's the frontier question. I'm from the United States, and one of the sort of central portions of our history is the movement west across the country, and the waves of colonization that displaced the people before. So, there were indigenous people that were displaced by the settlers that moved west. Then the first wave of settlers was displaced by the next wave of settlers. The sheep ranchers went first, and then the cattle ranchers showed up and ran them off. And then the railroads came through, and big corporations started running people off, and the whole eminent domain thing. While it may seem like those questions are answered, the government may say, if you go stake, out a piece of land, it belongs to you. That changes very quickly when economic pressures show up. When the railroad came through, all of a sudden all those staked claims just went away because the railroad had the ability to claim property on both sides of the railroad out to a mile. So if you built your house there, it wasn't your house anymore because the railroad was going through.
I don't think I'm spoiling anything about the books by saying that you don't solve this problem. Otherwise, it'd be pretty boring if the problems got solved immediately. Can you talk about some work outside of your own world that has had really creative and interesting and maybe inspiring for us ways of solving this problem of ownership, especially as it relates to a world that you're no longer sort of a part of?
Well, as far as literature that talks about solving the problem, there's a wide variety of that. Ursula Le Guin wrote a book called The Dispossessed, where she was comparing kind of two societies with kind of a Marxist, rigid authoritarian culture and an anarchist culture, and comparing them back and forth with pluses and minuses on each side. There's China Miéville has talked a lot about social issues and visions of alternate worlds where systems are built differently. The thing with all of those is that they're generally very speculative work. I mean, the work that claims to solve the problem has to remain speculative because we haven't actually solved it yet. So it's all, the idea there is all of these writers are taking images of what they think the future could be and what they think alternatives could be, and trying to play them out in these fictional settings.
Yeah, and the solutions that some of the writers come up with that feel very realistic are also the ones that I most greatly disagree with. Heinlein with Starship Troopers, his position was that you own anything that you can defend. So it's a very militaristic sort of view that if you claim something and you have the ability to run anyone off who wants to take it, then that's actually what makes you own it. So it's not a position I actually agree with, but it certainly feels like where the world is today.
I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, the Heinlein position does resemble a lot some of the problems that we have here and have had in the past. What is it about, and especially, what does sci-fi try to talk about with regards to humans and their role in the universe as a whole? What is it about us that makes us want to drive people off and hold on to stuff?
That's the thing with humans is that we physically very unchanged for about the last 150,000 years, and for most of that period, the way you solved problems was you stabbed it with something sharp. Now we're at a point where social pressures and culturally and with our civilization, we're trying to move beyond that, but a lot of our instincts and impulses are still driven by a long period of evolution in which violence was our answer to problems like, do I own enough stuff? And we still have that feeling that we judge our worth by comparing what we own to the person next to us. And if we own more than them, then we feel we're more valuable than they are. And it's hard to get rid of that. It's very ingrained in us.
And on the other hand, cooperation is also ingrained in us. We also, the our early ancestors who struck out on their own and did it all by themselves tended not to survive. We are a cooperative species, and you see some of those instincts reflected in literature too. You see things like Always Coming Home. You see things where it's Steve Sterling's Change series, where after a great collapse, people come together into new societies and new creations, because that creation of tribes also has an upside, where you get to have a tribe, you get to have your people, you get to have a group that can cooperate.
But you can't really rely on that, right? Like you can't bet on that happening.
You can't rely. Well, you can rely on it because it happens all the time. Dividing ourselves into tribes is what we do, and that has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that there's an inside, and the disadvantage is that there's an outside.
So one of the things that has come up at this conference a lot is, well, not a lot, but has come up is maybe we're not the right species of us to go out there. That, you know, humans are a great starting point, but maybe there's something beyond the human. You know, in our paradigm right now for the astronaut program is you look through every potential person who is interested in doing this job, and you go out and you get the best person. But maybe if we're actually going to be exploring outside of our comfort zone en masse, it's about making the right person instead of finding them.
I think that's a really interesting question. And talking about science fiction, we have versions of stories like that we're playing with the ideas now, even though we haven't put any of them into effect. There's a story called Reasons to be Cheerful by Greg Egan in particular, where it's talking about the way that consciousness rises up out of brains, the way that emotion is a function of how your brain is working, and because we can affect that, we can affect the other. When you have people who are going to be living in a space station for years, or living in a Mars colony that's very small and beginning, and they're going to be in that kind of submarine environment for a long time, maybe changing what humans are is a legitimate strategy moving forward.
And so people, I mean, there's a lot of work on this. There's Ted Chiang and John Scalzi who have written sort of at length about how somebody can be modified for this future use case. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those like scenarios that have been played out a little bit more detailed to be that expose some of our flaws and some of the sort of potential ways we can go down that road?
Yeah, I find myself very skeptical of the idea that we can just start designing a better version of us. I was listening to actually today I was listening to a conversation with a microbiologist that I follow, who was talking about the fact that we try to design viruses and we always make them worse because when we're working on them, they have billions of years of survival pressure that have created what exists, and we've got a couple of years in a lab to try to figure out something better. And that's a virus, the simplest quasi-life on the planet, and we have trouble making it better than what evolution made it. The idea that we can take something as complex as we are and just flip some genetic switches and suddenly make a better version, I'm very skeptical of that idea. I mean, we're going to try to do it. There's no doubt. Those things are already in motion. But I'm really skeptical of the idea that it's going to be as easy as some people try to think it is.
But to go back to the literature, something like Ted Chiang, when he's talking about the story Liking What You See, a documentary, he's talking about changing, again, by physically changing somebody's brain and by physically changing how a brain functions, changing their experience of beauty, changing their experience of status, changing their experience of how they get along with their other friends and coworkers and fellow students. And that's not something we can do, and it's not something that has been done, but it's the kind of thing that science fiction really excels at, because it's not impossible. And while we don't know how to do that now, 20, 30 years from now, maybe. And if we can get to a place where we can engineer humans that don't judge status relatively. They don't look at the guy next to him and say, oh, he's got he's got a nicer shirt than I do, I hate him. It may become possible to build these new societies in these other environments, or it may be a terrible mistake and we get out there and find out exactly why we had that in the first place.
And the thing that the literature allows us to do is talk about the ethics of it, talk about the possible problems of it before we do it.
Right.
Before we start making the mistakes, we can really kind of think about it. And that's where fiction helps, because we can begin having the conversation long before we're actually ready to physically do the things.
And it seems like you might have had this conversation when writing your books, because you kind of use the flip side. Instead of creating life for outer space, you do have another sort of subspecies that was created by outer space with the same survival pressures. Talk a little bit about the epigenetics and how you think that could play into the way we live in the outer solar system.
Well, so much of evolution, so much of the idea of evolution is about fitting into an environment. When you start putting people into a completely novel environment, your options are you're going to have a very different bunch of people on the other end, or you're going to have a bunch of dead folks. There's not really anything else. When you talk about living, growing up in zero gravity. Now, in our book, we talk about, we posit some things about development in zero gravity. We say that people are going to wind up much taller because there's not the gravity pulling down on them. We imagine that their bones are much more fragile. We imagine that their heads are larger because there's more, the way that blood flows in zero gravity isn't the same as what we're built for here. Now, we're making all that up. We may be wrong in the specifics. But when you start having babies in low gravity, we'll find out what the truth is. We'll find out how that actually works. And it will be different. That's, our exact version of it, probably not, but something will be there.
It's also possible that maybe humans aren't the right part of this planet to go out first, though, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about how sending a human out to explore another planet may be a terrible idea just from the get-go.
Exploring it, I think maybe we could get away with. Living there seems optimistic. The phrase I keep reaching for is, we're going to terraform apex predator first. We're going to take the animal that takes the most support and the most of the widest food web, and we're going to send that one first. That seems like an odd choice.
It's always tofu.
There's always tofu, yeah. Or
so if it's not, so you could see yourself, or you could see a world in which, and this is again just thinking like science fiction writers, where we send out bacteria or plants or viruses to go change one aspect of a world, or would you want to be talking about changing multiple systems at the same time?
Well, a biosphere is an incredibly complex thing. In our fiction, we talk about simple, complex systems that, when you try to build a biosphere that wasn't developed naturally, it tends to be very fragile because there's not hundreds or thousands of things that fill the same ecological niche. So when something dies, it tends to take a lot of things with it. The problem of building a biosphere is you don't want to just send one thing. You want to send a plethora of viruses to inhabit the soil and a lot of simple organisms to begin sort of churning, worms and things like that. And it's a big engineering problem. It's not a small problem.
But to kind of go to the title of the speech here, title of the presentation, what we're doing as fiction writers isn't speculation for a scientist. We're not trying to tell a scientist what the answers are. Every time that a science fiction writer has tried to actually posit what the future will be, we've been wrong. There's a couple of things people guessed right, but the vast majority of our guesses have been completely wrong.
What was right?
Communication
satellites. That was Arthur Clarke. Jules Verne was talking about submarines. There's a few of those things that they got fairly close, but mostly we've been wrong.
What has been like really, really wrong?
Cyberspace.
Cyberspace was, that was,
Yeah.
everything in the 80s was going to be like, putting your mind in some kind of virtual reality thing. It turns out if you just type something into Google, it tells you the answer. Way better. Way better. We didn't get cell phones. Nobody foresaw that we would be going around with a little device that could connect to, it breaks every plot before 1995. All the plots before then were about, not being able to get information to somebody. Now it's like, I've texted it. How are we going to get this information out? You're going to tweet it, and then everybody's going to know. And it's,
One of our good friends is a science fiction writer who wrote a fairly famous cyberpunk book in the 80s, and the end of the book, a big plot point is the hackers rushing around the city looking for a payphone so they could hack into the internet. That just looks ridiculous now. But back then it seemed very futuristic.
And our stuff has dated since we started writing it. The pace of discovery is such that there are things we put into book one, and then we actually sent a probe to series, and we found out, okay, we're going to have to make a little creative editing here and there, because as you discover things, all of the stuff you've written before gets called into question, and that's fine, because we're not trying to be rigorous speculation. We're trying to be visions of a future. We're trying to be stories about people. In point of fact, starting off mining by sending a bunch of miners to an asteroid is probably a terrible plan. And probably send a bunch of robots, because they don't squish when you go real fast. They don't have unions. OSHA, there's no kind of safety issue with a robot that there is with a human being. But it makes a terrible story, so we don't do that.
So speaking of robots, one other thing that science fiction has explored a lot is the sort of robot or machine assistant. And it goes back to something that we talked about a lot when we were preparing for this, which is like our trust in machines. And it's something that they talked about a lot at the AI Summit here. And even in the Museum of the Future's AI exhibit, there's a really interesting interplay between, like, about half of it is the AI is getting it right, and half of it the AI has gone a little bit wrong. Where do you see that playing out for us now, and where do you see that playing out in science fiction now that we're so far along in AI?
Yeah, I tend to be on the Neil deGrasse Tyson side of that. I think where we're actually moving toward is a bunch of highly specialized intelligent systems that are really good at one thing. Like he talked about self-driving cars. I think that makes a lot of sense. Self-driving airplanes, that sort of thing.
Medical Watsons.
Yeah, medical expert systems that are good at diagnosing disease. All of that stuff makes sense to me. I think at least right now, it feels unlikely that we're going to try to develop one thing that's good at everything. I don't know what that's, he talked about the economics of things. I don't know what that's useful for. I don't know who pays for that. Certainly people will pay for things where a machine is really good at one thing. And we're seeing more and more of that, the home assistant, the Alexa, where you can tell something at home to do something and it does it for you. Turn my lights on, turn my music on, start the stove. I think that sort of thing, we're going to make tons of advancement in that in the next few years.
The other thing, though, is that there's this engine of mundanity that comes with this. I mean, a cell phone is amazing to me because I remember when there wasn't one. My daughter doesn't have that experience. Self-driving cars are amazing to me. By the time my daughter is ready to drive, they will be mundane and normal. There's a generational pegging of experience that comes with this. And we as humans, we peg to original experiences. That's why you can't explain Windows to your grandmother. That wasn't something she grew up with. As we see AI become integrated, it's going to become invisible. As we see these new inventions come up, our children are going to accept them as normal. They're not going to be strange for them in the way that they are for us, and they're not going to be frightening for them in the way that they are for us.
I mean, what science fiction offers a lot of these first experiences and first exposures to these technologies, though. And you have seen a lot of general AI, which is the non-specific sort of AI, in science fiction, recent science fiction, and even older science fiction from Star Trek, even. Do you think there's any kind of danger of trusting it too much because there's so much beneficent AI?
Well, I don't think so. I think most of the AI that we saw in the early stuff, we're very skeptical of one way and another. HAL 9000 from 2001 is not the good guy. Jack Williamson's With Folded Hands is talking about the dangers of becoming so reliant on machine assistance that we stop pursuing human drives and human interests. There's a lot of warning about AI. But like with cyberspace, it's probably all wrong. We probably got that off. And our actual experience of it will, I think the kind of the conundrum of science fiction is we get it wrong, but we give people the visions to go find out and how to do it right.
You begin the conversation. There's a whole generation of engineers that watch Star Trek, where Kirk would flip out his little communicator, and that's the generation that had invented the flip phone and started working on the cell phones, because they saw that and they said, oh, we should have that, and they started working on it. So at least we can begin the conversation, and conversation about how much do we want to trust machines, how much do we believe they can help us versus expose us to new dangers. We can have those conversations now. We can talk about that in fiction, and the engineers who are developing that are watching that on TV or in movies or reading it, and they're already thinking about it before the problem exists.
I mean, just like the engineers who saw Picard on his communicator invented the flip phone, Mark Zuckerberg named his home AI Jarvis after the sort of benevolent assistant in Iron Man.
Yeah.
And Facebook is putting a lot of emphasis on AI right now. If there's, they're one of a few companies in the world who actually have the money and the technological skill to make a general AI. So,
and along with that, the dangers that science fiction has envisioned for AI are probably going to be different than the ones we actually encounter. I mean, there may be some overlap, but not only do we have the idea that AI might exist and the idea that AI might be amazing and the idea that AI might be useful for a bunch of things, there is an idea that AI might have dangers, even if we don't know what those are. Even if there's a whole bunch of different stories outlining different kinds of problems. It's a conversation that loops back on itself.
It loops back on our first point, actually, because if you do create a successful and even benevolent and functional AI, it could just trigger those same feelings of tribalism that we could bring into space among the human population out there.
The one where we're looking at AIs and thinking, damn, they can play chess better than we can?
Or you're looking at AI and they're a culture that you use to do meaningless work. And as they gain consciousness, you don't gain as much respect for them.
That gets into what the nature of consciousness is, and that's really weird territory.
We only have 2 minutes left on the panel,
probably not
so we can't do that. Speaking of 2 minutes left on the panel, are we going to have any questions? If so, we can take some questions, and if not, I know that we'll keep talking. Okay, we're going to have some questions, so we're going to do question and answer then. Do we have a microphone for them, or can you speak really loud? All right.
Excellent.
Oh, wait, you can have a microphone and speak really loud.
Hi. So I'm a big lover of science fiction. I'm a journalist. I grew up with things like H.G. Wells. And I look at H.G. Wells, I look particularly at The Time Machine, which was an allegory written for industrialists where the poor were oppressed, the wealth got wealthier and wealthier, the poor ended up in a hole in the ground, and the rich ended up being a complete effete elite who basically the poor people ended up eating. And then I look at Ray Bradbury, and I look at the Martian Chronicles, and the Martian Chronicles is really, at heart, a sort of discussion about race, about race relations in America in the 40s and 50s, and there's a lot of references to those issues which were going on in America at the time. So for you, what would be the big central problem that you think your science fiction could expose to policymakers and so on.
I think you want to
go?
Okay. I think the big thing that we have tried to address with our particular project is the fact that history does not end when you go into space. That all of the really dangerous things that we find when we move out into space are going to be the ones we packed with us. As an organism, we have our patterns, we have our history, we have our ways that we behave. And as the technology changes, the expression changes, but we're kind of the same monkeys we were back in the Pleistocene. And even as noble and wonderful and amazing as human beings are, we're also flawed, and we're going to remain admirable and flawed on Mars and Europa and out to the stars.
Go for it. I know they're going to start telling us we're out of time.
Yeah,
really
so
soon, but it's cool. They can't do anything about it.
Yeah, so when we look at the things that we do, I'm working here for the Dubai government, future foresight is actually always something that we're trying to figure out the best can. If you actually write your stories, there is two aspects actually that I'm interested in. How much you actually orientate yourself with those things that come up from futurists, from, I don't know, whatever sources are out there. How much are you influenced by that? And the second thing is how much actually you try to be independent with the stories that you come up with. Because often what I can see is, at least for the space that I'm working in, there is actually this aspect, what you just said, it doesn't really happen often, but it is often quoted that science fiction actually is a great inspiration for, let's say, things to be adopted in one way or the other, or at least being kind of a role model when new things are developed or referred to as this could be a future vision. So I just want to see your view, how you actually try to be independent from that, and secondly, how you use that still as an orientation from futurists and other people around you.
Well, I mean, yeah, you want to be aware of the current state of technology and what people think is going to be in the near future. You move much beyond that. Most futurists are also wrong. They're about as wrong as science fiction writers are. So it's interesting to read that stuff, but for me, the main thing science fiction is aspirational. It's, we write about a humanity that's living all over our solar system. It's pretty unrealistic, but it's very aspirational. It's a vision of future humanity that is probably not the one we're going to wind up with, but it's an interesting one, and hopefully it brings up some interesting conversations that inform what we really are going to do, even though it's probably not going to match what we're doing.
And there's something to be said about. I was talking earlier about pegging to first experiences, about how the first time that you like buy a car, that's the price for cars. The first time that we experienced flip phones was Star Trek. The first time that I experienced people mining asteroids was Alfred Bester's Stars My Destination. I've had a bunch of experiences of things that haven't happened yet because this is the literature I read growing up. I think that's kind of the loop. That's you get excited by it, and then that excites other people, and then that excites other people, and that excites other people, and then you have this kind of beautiful feed-forward loop where we all wind up as part of the same imaginative job. And my part's easy because I just make stuff up, and these folks have the hard job of actually figuring out how that would work.
I'm going to let you have the last word, and we're going to end it. I guess I had the last word. Sorry. But we have to end it now because we're out of time. Thank you all very much, and thank you all very much, and we'll see you around the Sunday.